The next texture that we'll take a look at creating is fur. And fur is going to be one of the trickier ones because when you're drawing fur, you're typically drawing it on an animal, and an animal is not a simple shape like a torus or a sphere or a cube. It's a combination of many of those shapes. The legs of the animal could be cylinders. The head of the animal could be a sphere. The horns of the animal could be a cone, and so on. And so what's difficult about that is you have to contour the fur texture to all of the forms on the animal. If you just paint it on flat, then the animal is going to look two-dimensional. So what better way to represent this than to do it on the torus? Because the torus is kind of one of the more complicated shapes to put shading onto. But again, this could be an animal's leg or an animal's tail or an animal's body. So I'm going to start by showing you two different ways to do this. One is the easy way, but it's not necessarily the best way. And the other will be the more advanced, difficult way, but it'll give you some more flexibility. So the easy way, let's go ahead and right-click on the torus, choose Select Layer Content, hide the selection with Ctrl-Shift-H and create a new layer. I'm going to call this layer Particle because I'm going to use a particle brush. I'm going to look at my particle brushes here and I'm going to select Flow Fur, but there's also some in the default Corel Painter category if you take a look. I'm going to choose a lighter color here and I'm going to paint in some fur, and you can see that it gives me this repetitive fur pattern, which is nice. Lots of fur instantly. The problem is it's all going in one direction. That direction is dictated by the tilt of my pen. So right now my pen's tilted in one direction, but if I tilt it in another direction and I rotate it, you can see I can rotate the curvature of the fur, which is fine, but it becomes really difficult to do when you get to these other angles. I'm right-handed, and so I can do this side well. The other side's hard. And yes, I could flip my image and so on, but it just becomes really difficult. So I don't know that this is the best way to add fur. You might find, depending on what you're working on, that it works fine. But for me, I don't necessarily like this particular look, even if I can get it to line up. So you would want to add lighter and darker fur and so on, and then there you go, you have your fur texture. But it looks kind of flat, and you could try to contour it and do different things, but it's still going to look flat because too many of the hairs are going in the same direction. And that's not really how fur grows on an animal. So let's hide that example. Let's create a new layer, and let's try it a different way. I'm going to call this layer dark. I'll create one more layer, and we'll call it light. We'll start with the dark layer. That can be a multiply composite method. We'll choose a dark gray color, and we'll use the sponge to paint. Maybe we'll use a finer sponge too. Let's do something like this. The more hair you want on your animal or character, the finer the texture you're going to want to put down. So think of each of these spots as being a hair follicle. The hair hasn't come out of it yet, but it will. But we'll decide which direction the hair goes when we pull the hair out of it. Let's set our light layer to screen, and let's spray in some lighter color. Maybe a little bit in the shadow areas, but just not quite as much. So something like this. Now we want to zoom in pretty close so that we can see what we're doing. And we want to optimize the opacity of these layers here. So I want to just find a nice blend where this looks like hair texture and there's not too much light or too much dark. Something like that will work. I'm going to right click on my torus layer and I'm going to duplicate it. Then I'm going to merge the light and the dark and the torus duplicate together with Ctrl-E. I'll call that layer fur. On that fur layer, I'm going to select the diffuse blur blender, and I'm going to start pulling out hairs with very light pressure. And you can see if I contour in the direction that the torus should have its hair contoured, it starts to look like fine little fur. And again, light pressure is key here. But this is where it's tricky because the torus is curved, so the hair is curving up towards the back on the back side. It's curving down towards the front on the front side. And then you're looking at it kind of from the center, and so this is the center axis, so the hair needs to go up and to the left on the left side and up and to the right on the right side. So that's why it's really tricky. And then there's some fur that's pointed at you, so you don't really need to pull that down, mainly the fur on the top edge here. I'm using very light pressure. It's a very subtle effect, and this is going to be kind of the base layer here that we'll be working with. Again, if you pull in some white fringe, just use your Distorto brush to carefully pull that out and get rid of it. So now if we zoom out, you can see we have a nice furry texture. This is kind of shorter hair, like maybe on a rabbit or something. If we want longer fur, we can follow that same principle, but we'll want to use something streakier like the coarse oily blender. I want to deselect my active selection with Ctrl-D. I also want to change my dab stencil to just the paper, so I'm not using the flow map. And with a small brush, I can pull out some longer hairs right along the edge, and that just helps it look longer. I have that additional torus layer that's underneath everything. I'm going to go ahead and hide that. Go back to the fur layer. You can also pull out fur using the diffuse blur if you want shorter, fuzzier fur. But again, I want to follow the contour of this object. And you're going to get some white fringe down there at the bottom, but we'll take a look at how to fix that. Again, I'm following the direction that this should be contouring. I want to do it on the bottom side as well. Now let's go ahead and turn on Preserve Transparency, and we can fix this white fringe in a number of ways. One, we could use the Distorto brush to pull it down. You want to be very careful because you'll be pulling your hair, and you might be pulling it out of contour. That might not work, so pull in the direction that the hair is flowing. So you could get rid of it that way. Or you could just use a brush, sample one of the colors surrounding that fringe, and then just paint over it. But the problem is you're going to end up covering the edge with the same color when it should have some variation. So personally, I think the Distorto method works better in most cases. But it's up to you to experiment and see what works. If one doesn't work, try the other. Now, if you want longer fur, it gets a little trickier because with longer fur, it's generally better to draw the bulk of the fur manually. So for example, I could use the smooth palette knife, could select a lighter color here, and if I wanted longer fur, then I would want to draw in clumps of fur like so. And again, I would want to follow the contours of this object, but there's not really a quick and easy way to draw the fur. It'll look better and it'll look more realistic if you draw the fur little by little like this, rather than just expecting that there's going to be a brush that's going to be able to do it for you. But as you can see, I can go along the edge here and I can make this look like it's longer fur simply by lengthening it along its edge. And then of course you want to add darker fur and lighter fur, and you want to have a nice even mix of both. But even though that base layer I added was short fur, it still works because it fills in all those gaps in between. So you don't have to manually paint quite as many long hairs to get that illusion of furriness. So I'll just zoom back out and we can see my furry Taurus here starting to come together. I might make it a bit lighter over here in this area. But I think that's good enough for example's sake. I'm not going to paint fur on this whole thing, or that would take me quite a while. But that's the amount of dedication you're going to have if you're going to paint animals and people. You got to enjoy painting fur and hair. So I'm just going to go ahead and delete those extra layers. I'll just keep that basic fur layer there. And then one last thing before we move on to the next texture. On that fur layer, I'm going to turn on Preserve Transparency. And it may be helpful to use bulge and pinch in some cases to help your texture contour to the object that you're painting on. So I could bulge it out a bit in the center, and that helps compress it along the edges as well. And if we zoom out, we have a pretty good furry effect for our Taurus. Now, if I wanted to add color to this, I could add a color overlay just like I did with the cylinder and the cube, but I want this to be kind of a lighter gray color like it is now, so I'm just going to leave it as it is, and then we'll add some environment color to it a little bit later. Let's move on to the next texture, which is skin, and I'm going to add skin to the sphere. Heads are typically pretty spherical. They're a sphere that are flattened on the sides like this, at least a human head is. And if I pull down the bottom, you can see that I'm getting a shape that's very much like the human head. So while we're adding skin texture, we can just pretend that this is human skin. Now in this case, I don't want to start with this gray color because human skin does not look good. If you add a vibrant color on top of this gray, it's just not going to look right. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to go ahead and turn on Preserve Transparency, and I'm going to fill this sphere with something that's close to my skin color. And it's okay if it's a flat color like this because I'm going to add some shading to it so that I'm starting with something that's more appropriately skin colored. Add a little edge highlight here down towards the bottom. Sample that base color and make it a little bit darker, more desaturated, and I'll shift the hue a little bit. And we'll go even darker there so that it has a nice obvious shadow. Add a bit more of a highlight here on this. And then I'll go through and blend it with the diffuse blur just to smooth out those transitions. So what I'm ending up with is something that's very similar to that sphere I had before, except it's not gray, it's skin colored. I'm also going to select the bulge brush, and I'm going to bulge this out a bit. That'll help it look more spherical. Now I can begin adding my texture. So I'm going to right click on the sphere, select layer content, hide the selection with Ctrl-Shift-H, and I've created a few new layers here. I have one called base, blue, red, pores, and shine, and I want them to be stacked in this order. So the base layer, as you can imagine, is going to be a base layer of texture. I'm going to start with the sponge. I'm going to sample the darker color on my skin sphere. I'm going to set the composite method of that layer to multiply, and I'm going to put in a layer of texture. Now, skin is made up of a bunch of different cells. We have blood vessels under our skin, we have discolorations, we have blemishes, we have stubble, we have all kinds of different things that contribute to the texture of our skin. So this base layer is just going to be a base layer that gives it a little bit of grittiness and helps it look organic. I'm going to go to the blue layer. That's also going to be a multiply composite method. And I'll select a bluish color like this. I want to select the sponge. I want a really big sponge. And I'm just going to tap lightly to create a few veins here and there. Go to the red layer and repeat that, but with red. So I'm going to set that to multiply. Use a red color and just tap to add a little bit of red. Now we'll want to go through on those layers and we'll want to reduce the opacity. You can imagine that these are blood vessels under the skin. Some of your blood is red, some of it's blue, depending on how oxygenated it is. And it's covered by layers of skin, and so you'd only see it very faintly. Next, we'll go to pores. We'll set the composite method of that layer to overlay. And we can use an image hose nozzle for this. I'm going to choose the pores image hose nozzle. I created this nozzle using a very similar technique to what I did on the stone here by creating those pillow embossed holes. I need to select an image hose brush. So I'm going to choose linear size P, and I'll paint in some pores. And you can see it gives it that nice gritty skin texture. Let's go ahead and add one more layer between that and the shine layer. Because why not have some freckles too? Let's set that to multiply. Let's select a brown freckle color. And let's use the pepper spray for that. We'll keep our feature at 2. We'll make a really big brush here and we'll just click. That'll create a couple little freckles. Then we'll switch to the diffuse blur blender. And let's just blend those a little bit. That way they're not perfectly spherical because freckles are kind of odd shaped here and there. That helps just kind of set them in. We'll reduce the opacity to where you can just barely see that. That just adds a couple of very subtle details to our skin. I might even reduce the opacity of that pores layer as well so the pores aren't too deep there. And the last part of this effect is going to be accomplished by adding some shine. Now, people have oily skin. There's certain parts of the face that are more shiny than others, like the tip of the nose. So adding this shine really helps. I'm going to use the chalk brush for that. And I'm going to make sure that my dab stencil is set to flow map. I'll use white. I'll reduce the scale of my flow map. And I'll paint in some shiny white area over here near the light source on top of the highlight. If I overpainted too much, I can either add a mask and mask some of it away with black, or I can use the dab chalk eraser, which does basically the same thing, but it does it a little bit quicker, just to erase some of that so that we have just a little shiny spot right there near the light source. And then we can feel free to readjust the layers. If we want the veins to stick out more and have it be more veiny, we can do that. But you really have a lot of flexibility here. So I think with that, we have a pretty decent skin texture. You'll have to try it on one of your portrait paintings and see how it looks. So those are techniques for creating 5 very common forms of texture. I know that we didn't add anything to the cone here, but we'll do something special to that in a minute. What I want to do now to complete this effect is I want to add some environment color and then do some focal blurring. So typically it's good to have your environment color selected ahead of time before you do any of your shading and adding of texture and things like that. But because we're working digitally, we can do things in any order that we want. So I'm going to go to the canvas layer, which is really just my bottommost layer here. And I'm going to create a new layer above that. We'll call that layer sky, and we'll pick a nice sky blue color. We'll make sure we don't have any selections active by hitting Control D on our keyboard. And then we'll go ahead and fill that sky with that color. I think I want to adjust it a little bit, make it more like that. We'll click on OK. I'm going to select a darker blue and use the airbrush to make the top darker and have it fade down lighter as we get near the bottom. It helps it look more like a realistic sky. And so now we know that the lighting in our environment is going to be white from the light that's coming from the light source, but also there's going to be some reflected light from the environment because the blue from the sky is going to reflect onto the objects as well. The white bright light, or the natural color, is going to be on the side facing the light, whereas the reflective environment color will be on the opposite side. So let's try that with the cylinder. I'm going to get a selection of the side of the cylinder, create a new layer. I'm going to put that on top of all the layers in the cylinder group. I'll just call this ENV color, that's short for environment color. I'll select the airbrush, select this blue color from the sky, dull it down just a little bit by desaturating it, and we'll paint in a little environment color over here on the side. I'm painting with the edge of the brush, and I'm trying not to go too far into my shadow there, but already you can see that that fits this into the environment. We could do a little bit on this side as well. Now you could, if you wanted to, go in and add some finer details. You could use the detail oils brush and you could put in some little lines and creases and things like that, because that kind of stuff would be catching the environment color as well. The sand might also reflect up onto the wood, so we could add in some environment color for that too. We'll just call this sand. We'll sample our sand color. And we'll put in a little bit of that near the bottom there. It can just be very subtle. And again, you could use the detail oils brush to put in a few little speckles here and there that are lighter colored. And I think that looks pretty good for the cylinder. Let's move on over to the cube. Mainly we want to focus on the dark side, so let's choose side. We'll create a selection from that layer, create a new layer above it. I'll just call it ENV for environment. And we'll sample our sky color again. We'll dull it down a little bit. And we'll just paint in some environment color here on the side. We'll reduce the opacity of it. And then just do a before and after until you can see that it's having enough impact. On the front side, we want to add some sand color. So we'll go to the front layer, we'll right click on it. We'll choose select layer content, hide the selection with Control-Shift-H, create a new layer, sample our sand color, and just put in a little bit of that. We can reduce the opacity if it's too strong. I think that looks pretty good. Might even be good to add a little bit of that blue color, but not very much, just to give it a little bit of a blue tint. And I think that looks pretty good for our cube. Let's move on to the sphere. I'm going to get a selection of the sphere, hide the selection, create a new layer. I'm going to move that to the top of the sphere group. Again, I'll just call it ENV for environment. Use that same airbrush with that same blue color. And just put in a little bit of environment color on the sides and near the bottom. If the sphere is near the sand, we could put in some of the sand color as well. Sand color is very close to the skin color, so I don't know that it's really necessary in this case. I think it's better just to focus on the environment color here. Might reduce the opacity a bit as well. And I think that looks pretty good for the sphere. Let's move on to the torus. I'm just going to delete that extra layer. That was my original torus shape. And what I have here is the fur layer, which is just the torus with fur sticking out of it. I'm going to right click on that layer, choose select layer content, hide the selection with Control-Shift-H, create a new layer. And I'm going to use that same blue color just to go ahead and fill. I can try color, or I can try multiply. Let's try color. What I want to do is just give it a little bit of blue flavor so that it's not completely gray. I'm going to create another new layer. I'm going to set that to multiply. And then near all the shadow sides, I'm going to put in more of that environment color just to reestablish the shadows. Because even though this fur is gray, just like the stone, it is going to pick up some environment color. Reduce the opacity of that a bit. Might even go back to that fur layer and then go to Effects, Tonal Control, Adjust Colors. If I want it to be brighter, I could value it up a bit, or I could go to Effects, Tonal Control, Equalize. I can brighten it up this way. If I want to make just the light colors lighter and not affect the shadows, or I could bring the shadows in and make those darker. I think something like that will work. And then just feel free to play with the balance of the layers to get the kind of blend that you want. I'm going to create one more new layer. I'm going to set that to color. I'll add in some sand color as well near the bottom here. Reduce the opacity of that. And if I group those layers and do a before and after, you can see that it's adding just a subtle environment color, so it's not too overwhelming. I'm going to go to that blue tint layer, and I'm actually going to use the dab chalk eraser to erase some of it, just to add a little bit of a highlight there on the top side where it's catching the most light. And I might even use the airbrush too, just to go over that. And basically what I'm doing here is I'm making the lightest area on this a neutral color, because the light is going to be neutral that's reflecting off of it from the light source. We really only want the areas that are facing away from the light to have that environment color. So let's try that again. I think that looks much better. I'm going to go to the fur layer now, turn on Preserve Transparency, and I just want some of these edges to pop out a bit more. So in those areas where there was some dark patches, I'm just painting right along the edge with my airbrush with a lighter color. And that just helps balance those out. So you can see I can still go and change the underlying shading without affecting the texture. Just as well I could change the color if I wanted to, and because the texture is all on separate layers, I don't have to worry about having to repaint the texture or mess up the texture if I make a change. So although there's a lot of layers going on here, I have a lot of flexibility. Now last but not least, we have the cone, and I know we didn't really add a texture to that, but let's go ahead and just make the cone reflective, because the reflective surface is, in a sense, a texture. So let's go to the cone layer, and let's deselect our active selection, and then let's go ahead and fill the cone with that environment color. Then I'm going to use the airbrush to paint in some of the colors that are surrounding the cone. So I have the color I sampled from the skin here. I'm going to put in some colors from the sand. And of course, we'll want our light streak here as well to start at the tip, and then get wider as we go down. So you can really just block it in kind of rough like this. We'll turn off Preserve Transparency. We'll right-click on our cone and we'll duplicate it. And then we'll go to Edit Free Transform. And we can choose either Distort or Perspective Distort. I'm going to choose Perspective Distortion. And I'm just going to squish in the tip of the cone here, like that. Click on the check to commit. Now we have our nice reflective cone. I might go in here using the polygonal lasso tool just to kind of take this center area and punch it out more and make it more white, like so. And then go through and blend it with a diffuse blur to soften it a bit. And I think that looks pretty good for our reflective cone. The base of the cone needs to have some environment color. And so to do that, we can just right-click on the cone base, select Layer Content, hide the selection with Control-Shift-H, create a new layer, set it to color, and we can take a dark blue color, fill it with that, and just reduce the opacity until we get just a subtle blue tint, and our reflective cone is complete. Now at this point, the only thing left to do is add a little bit of focal blurring. So let's take a look at how to do that. I'm going to go ahead and save a copy of my artwork by going to Save As. That way I'll have a copy with the layers and without the layers. After saving my copy, I'm going to go to each of these groups and I'm just going to merge them with Control-E. That's going to take all of those layers on the groups and compress them together into a single layer. So for example, now my plane is just a single layer, my cube is just a single layer. Let's start with the cylinder. I'm going to zoom into the cylinder. I'm going to make sure I don't have any selections active by doing Control-D on my keyboard. Then I'm going to select the Blur Blender, and I'm going to blur right along the edge of the cylinder because that's the area that's moving away from me in three-dimensional space, so it should get blurrier if we want it to look realistic. Blur the bottom edge a bit too, just to kind of smooth that out. We could blur the top edge of the rim there where it's moving away from us. Now it looks a lot more realistic. If you find that a light or a dark edge is created and you don't like the way that looks, again, you can use the Distorto brush, turn on Preserve Transparency, and then just push that edge away, like so. So you want to use very, very short strokes. I think that looks pretty good for the cylinder. Let's move on to the sphere. I'm going to turn off Preserve Transparency, select that Blur Blender, and just paint right along the edge on all the edges here, because those are the edges that are moving away in three-dimensional space. Again, if I'm getting that weird edge, I can use one of the distortion brushes. Let's use Bulge. Let's turn on Preserve Transparency, and let's just quickly bulge, because that'll get all the edges at once. That got rid of that weird edge. Let's move on to the cube. I'm going to turn off Preserve Transparency, select the Blur Blender, and then just blur some of the edges that are moving away in three-dimensional space. Turn on Preserve Transparency, and again, if I wanted to, I could use Bulge to just quickly push that edge away. Let's go down to the torus, turn off Preserve Transparency, and again, select that blur brush, and we'll just blur anywhere that's moving away from us in three-dimensional space to help this look more realistic. And then finally, we have the cone. We'll go ahead and blur the edges of that. And we don't want to forget our plane as well. And I think that's starting to look pretty good. I do notice that I forgot to add environment color to my plane, so let's go ahead and do that. It's not too late. We can choose Select Layer Content, create a new layer above the plane. We can set that to Multiply, and we can put in our blue color on the bottom edge of the plane there. Just fade it up, like so, and reduce the opacity. And what that does is that cools off the bottom edge a little bit, and then we can go ahead and just merge that layer down with the plane beneath it to make it a single layer. And I'd say with that, we have some pretty good looking textures on our objects here. The only thing that's really missing is shadows. If these objects are down on the ground plane, touching the ground plane, then they should have some cast shadow from the light. However, drawing a realistic cast shadow on these three-dimensional objects is something that I'd have to dedicate an entire tutorial to on its own, so I'm not going to do it in this case. We'll just imagine that each of these objects are floating above the ground plane, so they don't need a cast shadow. So that brings us to the end of this lesson on creating texture. By now you should be able to create a wide range of textures using a number of methods in your digital art software. Thanks for participating in this lesson, and be sure to check out more of my lessons and courses at gumroad.com/Aaron Rutten. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.